Okay. All right. Now, we have to us today David James Townsend. Did I get the last name correctly?
Perfect.
Okay. He's from Shujitsu University, and he will be talking about perceptions of peer assessment of presentations, something that I also am very interested in. So without further ado, David, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Timmy. I appreciate it very much. And thank you everyone for joining me today. I'm going to share some slides with you. Everything that's in the slides will also be on my PowerPoint today, but of course, please access them as you will. Just give me one moment. And if anybody else comes in later, I can, of course, post them again.
Thank you, David.
Okay, they should be popping up right now. Can you see them?
I can see it. It is a PDF file, so everyone, if you could please click on it. Thank you for the thumbs up, Joshua.
All right, once again, if anybody comes in later, I'll repost it, okay? But I'll begin now. Once again, everyone, thank you very much for joining me today. Here we go. I'm going to first go through a little bit of the history that I've had with peer assessment of oral presentations. A few years ago, I began teaching presentations at the university where I work. And one of the sort of issues that I had was, what do the students do when all the other presenters are doing their basically the same kind of presentation they just finished? And one of the things that we decided to do was to have the students engage in peer assessment. Now, there's many facets to peer assessment, and unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into all of it with you today. But of course, if you have any questions, my email address is included on the slides today, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. There will be some things that I will talk about that are very pertinent to the presentation today, and I'll get into those at a case-by-case basis. Now, my research into peer assessment, the first thing that I wanted to do was to see if the assessments that the students were conducting with each other were reliable. And I think that's really important, of course. If the students were not giving reliable assessments, then of course it probably wasn't a worthwhile endeavor. Now, after that, out of the research that I conducted, I found that the reliability of the students' ratings was fair, not super great, but once again, it's very subjective. These are second language learners or foreign language learners. But I decided that I wanted to undertake some research to see if I can improve the reliability. And I did this by increasing the rater training and trying to improve the training that I gave the students so they could be better raters. Finally, I decided, what do the students think? I've done a lot of research. I've had a lot of experience teaching presentations and peer assessment. So I decided to ask the students what they felt about everything that was going on in the classroom. And to do that, I will explain in a moment, I used a survey that was created by Fazel, and he was using this to check the perceptions of his students in Iran. And I'll get into that in a moment. But first, I'd like to explain the group of students that I had. It's a private university in Okayama, Japan, Jiu-Jitsu University. The students are second-year English majors. And this class meets twice a week, and we are practicing discussions and presentations. Now, I should note, it's about 50-50, but I should note that for this study, it's strictly only on the presentations aspect of the class, not the discussions. And the students meet 2 times a week for 90-minute lessons. So about 32 lessons a semester. All right, and once again, for each of the presentations that the students would do 3 presentations, formal presentations in the first semester, and 4 presentations, formal presentations in the second semester. And once again, I don't want to get into too much of the nuts and bolts of how that goes, but I would very much like to have the chance, but in this presentation I won't. Now, this is the instrument that I used to collect information. Once again, it was adapted from TEVAL. There are 10 questions, and it uses a 5-point Likert scale from 1 strongly agree to 5 strongly disagree. The questionnaire was translated into Japanese. That's my students' native language, and this was to make sure that they fully understood the questions and could answer to their best intentions. I should note at the bottom as well, there was a box for comments. This was optional, but I asked the students to please try to give comments to help me better understand their information, as well as to give me more qualitative information. Now, this is a really important point, everyone. The 10 statements that the respondents were asked to rank can be separated into 4 broad categories based on the type of information they are meant to solicit. Now, the first category would be items 1, 3, 5, and 10. And these items look at the effects of peer assessment on learning, motivation, and participation. Question number 10, item number 10 is a bit of an outlier. It asks them to just do, would they like to use peer assessment in future classes? The second broad category is item 2, and this asks students to examine their understanding of the requirements of the course. Did the teacher adequately explain what they should be doing? And do they have a good understanding of how they're supposed to rate, what they're supposed to rate in the class? Items 4 and 6 explore the effects of peer assessment on class interactions. Notably, item 4, this is teacher-student interaction, and item 6, this is student-student interaction. And finally, items 7, 8, and 9 are used to probe the students' attitudes towards assessing their peers. Item 7, are students, do they feel they're eligible to assess their classmates' performances? Item number 8, the scores and comments that they were given, do they feel that these were fair and reasonable? And finally, number 9, did assessing other students' presentations help them with their own, in delivering their own presentations, making them better in the future, which is sort of one of the main points of this whole exercise. All right. Now, it was broken up into the first semester and the second semester. In the first semester, there were 19 students. And this is a lot of quantitative data. It kind of is a little overwhelming, but I'll try to go through it. Now, the first thing that jumps out is there is only one person responded in a negative agreement. That was in item number 3. Strongly in agree and somewhat agree, I'm going to lump together into basically rate agreement, okay? And I'm going to go through each of the 4 broad categories. For category number 1, once again, looking at the effects of peer assessment on learning, motivation, and participation, there was a rater agreement of 85.5%. This is quite overwhelming. Undecided, it was 13.2%. And once again, the only person to respond with any disagreement, rater disagreement, was on item number 3. Now, going on to the next broad grouping, the students' understanding of the requirements. This was overwhelming 94.7% rater agreement. And this was the number one highest rate of agreement. Undecided was only one person, that was 5.3%, and there was no rater disagreement. The next grouping, effects of peer assessment on class interactions. This was rater agreement of 73.7%. And this had the highest undecided at 21%. Excuse me. And next, We go to the final one, the students' attitudes towards assessing their peers. This had the second, almost equal to the top rater agreement, and this was 93%. And notably, everyone, items number 7 and number 8 had perfect rater agreement, positive rater agreement. There was no undecideds and no negative agreement. However, number 9, there was some undecided at 71.1%. Now, generally speaking, everyone, I was very happy with this. I feel that there was basically the students seemed to agree with peer assessment. They seemed to understand there was a positive take on the use of peer assessment in my class. As I mentioned, there was a basic average rater agreement of 86.31% in all 10 items. And unfortunately, with somewhat agree and undecided, there was quite a majority of these students answered within this range. And I think this shows that there was a tenuous agreement, that they weren't completely sold, completely bought on whether or not this was a good thing to have in the classroom, even though generally they agreed. This was something I wanted to check in the second semester to see if this, especially if the undecided would change, if people would become more sort of, they would feel more strongly in how they view peer assessment in this class. So I'll now go to the second semester. Oh, I'm sorry. First, I'll go through the comments. Once again, I asked the students for comments to get more qualitative feedback, and 9 of 19 students did make a comment. 6 of the 9 referenced the scoring ratio. 5 felt that the ratio was good, and I didn't mention earlier, but when the formal assessment, 70% of the score would be from the teacher, 30% would be from the students. And they felt, majority of them felt this was fair. 1 felt it should be a little bit higher in the students' favor. This was something I'd consider in the future. 2 students commented that the class was very practical and useful. 1 student appreciated the varied feedback. I was very happy with this comment. They understood that this was something that they could use to help them in the future to make their presentations better going forward. And 1 student unfortunately felt that my class was overly repetitive and not fun. Now, going to the second semester. In second semester, there were 17 students. These were the same students, I should let you know. 2 unfortunately didn't return. Now, as you can see, the somewhat disagree, there was a few more respondents, and the undecided also. Now I'll go through in the same way. In the effects of assessment on learning, motivation, and participation, the positive rater agreement was 89.7. This actually went up by 0.43% overall. And the undecided actually was reduced somewhat by 5.8%, from 13.2 to 7.4. Unfortunately, an extra student also found somewhat disagreement. They decided that they went from undecided to somewhat disagree on this point. The next broad grouping, students' understanding of the requirements. It went from, virtually stayed the same, I should say. As well, the undecided virtually stayed the same. So that didn't change. And the next grouping, effects of peer assessment on class interactions. This went from 73.7% and it went up to 82.3% positive agreement. So it went up 8.6%. The undecided dropped slightly, but this of course was because 1 of the students went to somewhat disagree. And finally, the last grouping, the students' attitudes towards assessing their peers. This went from 86.3%. Unfortunately, it dropped 6.7% from 93%. And the undecided stayed virtually the same, but unfortunately 3 students went to the somewhat disagree column. So what does this mean? Looking once again at the, now this is a very interesting point. The undecided dropped almost in half, but the strongly agree and somewhat agree went up. It actually increased very, very little, but it actually increased somewhat. And the key, I think, point was the somewhat disagree increased quite a lot. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think this was actually a good thing that during this second semester, the students sort of solidified their understanding of what peer assessment, what I was trying to do through peer assessment, and they sort of came to a more, they sort of kind of had a stronger understanding. And I don't think this was necessarily a bad thing. And finally, I'm going to go to the comments. 8 of 17 students made a comment in the second semester. Let me just get this out of the way. 3 students commented that they should continue doing it. 2 students felt the information was interesting and useful. 3 students commented that the class helped them become better presenters. This actually went from 1 student to 3. And this was very interesting one. One student mentioned that if 10 students assessed their presentation and 1 gave a bad score, it was unfair. So I think this is generally, they were looking at feeling that they didn't maybe agree that the students, their fellow students were giving them fair assessments, or they were a little bit worried about that. Now, I'm going to look at the questions. I'm basically finished. I would like you, if you do have any questions, of course, I have references here. My email, of course, is also provided in the slides, but I'd like to now, where am I? I'm going to entertain some questions now.
Okay. Before we get into the questions,
Yes.
I'd like to thank David for a very quick but very significant presentation, I believe. And so if anybody can unmute their mics or even turn on their video, let's give David a round of applause, please. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Val. Okay, we do have some time for some questions, so I'm sure some of you have some, so please feel free to ask. Either you can type it or you can just unmute your mic and David will gladly try to answer them.
Thank you very much. All right, Joshua, this is a really important question. Thank you very much. Basically, the students rated each other. There was a lot of rater training involved, of course, and I would love to go into more on that. Unfortunately, I can't right now. There were, the students were rated on things such as rater skills, on posture, on voice, on gestures, the use of gestures, and the language used, and hopefully it was simple language so that their other students would understand. And the final point was eye contact. So those were the 3 main skills that they were rated on. There were minor subcategories. For example, the gestures were voice gestures as well as body gestures. Voice gestures were the use of emphasis and possibly emotion in their presentations. And in the actual presentations, the rating scale was 10 points, a Likert scale. They were rated from 1 to 10. And once again, I also rated them holistically, giving them a score. And the students, the teacher score was worth 70% of their formal assessment, and the students were worth 30%, the combined score of the students. All of the students together, their aggregate score, their average score was 10%. There was a lot of rater training. If the students were giving very low scores, or if they were giving, for example, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, I would try to meet those students and try to give them extra training. All right, I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but if you have a follow-up, I'd be happy to entertain it.
Joshua gave a thumbs up, so I'm assuming he
Oh,
was
okay.
satisfactory.
That was
Let's
great. Thank you
continue
very
on.
much.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Joshua. We have two more questions. One is from Yoshihide Suga. David, good job with this presentation. I wonder what the first semester data would have looked like in comparison with that of the second semester if you remove the responses from those two students who were not in the class in the second semester.
That's a really good point. Some of you might think that the students left my class, and to be quite honest, I'm not exactly sure, but some of my students also go on overseas studies. So whether or not they were good or bad students, these were anonymous surveys, so I'm not exactly sure where they fell on that spectrum, but it is a good, once again, the students, it was anonymous surveys. I don't exactly know which ones. They might have been students that left the class because they dropped my class, or they might have left because of going overseas to do studies. So I'm not exactly sure to answer your question. Thank you very much, though, Yoshihide, for that good question.
He has given you a thumbs up. And with that, let me move on to the next one by Jack Bauer. In your previous research, how did you evaluate the reliability of student assessments? I often find that my students go easy on each other. Also, were the students' ratings anonymous? So 2 questions.
Very good question. The students' ratings were anonymous to their students, to the other students. They did not know who gave them the assessment, but I actually had access to it. That way I could give them follow-up training. That's the only reason for that. If students were giving them very high ratings or very low, I just wanted to make sure they understand sort of what I was trying to get them to do. I think, of course, there's many aspects of ratings, assessments and ratings that are very difficult. Of course, there's what they call outliers, students that give very crazy scores, either low or high. There's also when students give, they just will give 777 or whatever. And that's always a really, really big issue to do when you're trying to get students to assess each other. I felt that I feel I did a pretty good job. The reliability, I don't know if I have enough time to go through how I evaluated the reliability. I did quite a few different studies on that, and I presented a JALT on that in the past. It's a bit of a difficult thing to go into here, but I used a rater reliability scale, and I evaluated, well, I'd like to get into that, but maybe we could do that at another time. Anybody else?
Okay. Okay. And on that note, I will be ending the question and answer part, and I will be stopping the recording. I will be stopping it right about now.